The town of Milfield, Nebraska doesn't appear on most maps. With just over 3,000 residents, it's the kind of place where the grain silo casts the longest shadow, and everyone claims to know everyone else's business. But as we would discover, even in the smallest communities, people keep secrets. Milfield was always safe, you know? That's what we all believed, says Martha Donovan, owner of the local diner, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. The kind of town where you don't lock your doors at night, until the Sinclair robbery changed everything. On the night of April 17, 2010, the Sinclair gas station on the edge of town was robbed at gunpoint. The cashier, 19-year-old Jeremy Watts, was pistol-whipped and left with a concussion. The perpetrator made off with $3,427 and the security footage from that night. I remember hearing the sirens, recalls Tom Gaines, who was a deputy sheriff at the time and is now Milfield's sheriff. In my 26 years of law enforcement, we'd never had an armed robbery. People were scared. They wanted someone caught. The investigation quickly focused on Robert Mercer, a 32-year-old construction worker with a history of minor offenses, mostly bar fights and a DUI from his early 20s. Robert had been laid off 3 months prior, and witnesses reported seeing his truck near the gas station around the time of the robbery. Robert was complicated, says Ellie Mercer, his younger sister, as she anxiously twists her wedding ring. He could be the most generous person you'd ever meet. He built my front porch himself when I couldn't afford to hire someone. But he had a temper, especially when he drank. Still, robbery? Violence? That wasn't him. The case against Robert wasn't particularly strong. Circumstantial evidence, an incomplete witness description. Then his wife of 8 years, Clare Mercer, came forward with testimony that would change everything. Clare was a beloved high school English teacher, known for her volunteer work with the town's literacy program. Her testimony provided what prosecutors called the missing piece. I remember it like it was yesterday, says District Attorney Patricia Wells, now retired. Mrs. Mercer entered my office, visibly distraught. She told me that Robert had come home late on the night of the robbery with more cash than they usually had. When she questioned him, he became agitated and told her to mind her own business. She also stated that a gun they kept in the house was missing for several days around that time. The courtroom footage from Robert's trial shows Clare on the witness stand, her voice barely audible as she recounts finding a wad of cash hidden in the garage and a shirt with what looked like blood spatter in the laundry basket. Robert, seated at the defense table, stares at her with a mixture of disbelief and rage. I've never seen a man look at someone with such hatred, remembers court reporter Diane Mills. It was like something broke between them right there in that courtroom. Clare's testimony, combined with the circumstantial evidence, was enough for the jury. After deliberating for just 4 hours, they found Robert Mercer guilty of armed robbery and assault. The judge, citing Robert's prior record and the violent nature of the crime, sentenced him to 14 years in state prison. As officers led Robert away, courtroom witnesses recall him turning to Clare and saying, "I hope you can live with yourself. This isn't over." For Ellie Mercer, her brother's conviction never sat right. Clare changed her story. At first, she told me Robert was home with her that night. Then suddenly, she's telling the DA he came home late with money and bloody clothes. It just didn't add up. Sheriff Gaines, who was a deputy at the time, admits the case had loose ends. We never recovered the weapon or the stolen money. The cashier's description was vague at best. Without Clare's testimony, I'm not sure we would have gotten a conviction. After the trial, Clare faced backlash from Robert's family and some community members who believed she betrayed her husband. Others saw her as brave for coming forward. She did what she had to do, says Marcus Webb, Clare's colleague at the high school. I remember how withdrawn she became in the months before the trial. Looking back, I think she was afraid of him for a long time. Clare declined to divorce Robert immediately after his conviction, a decision that puzzled many in town. It would be another 2 years before she filed the paperwork, citing irreconcilable differences rather than the conviction. By then, Clare had transferred to work at the Milfield Public Library, a quieter position away from the whispers of high school students and their parents. Robert, meanwhile, began his sentence at the Nebraska State Penitentiary, maintaining his innocence through failed appeals and disciplinary incidents. The first few years were the hardest on him, says prison counselor James Moretti. He was angry, volatile, kept saying his wife set him up. It's common for inmates to blame others, but there was something different about his certainty. As Robert settled into his 14-year sentence, life in Milfield slowly returned to normal. But the ripples from that courtroom confrontation would eventually return to shore, years later, with devastating consequences. Time passes differently in prison. For Robert Mercer, the first 1,000 days were a blur of rage and denial. When inmates first arrive, especially those with long sentences, they go through stages similar to grief, explains Dr. Vanessa Torres, former prison psychologist at Nebraska State. Robert was stuck in anger longer than most. His file shows 7 disciplinary incidents in his first 3 years, mostly fights with other inmates who made comments about his wife. Prison footage shows a noticeably changed Robert by his 4th year of incarceration. The once robust construction worker had become leaner, harder, his movements precise and controlled. He began working in the prison library and enrolled in courses through a community college program. Something shifted in him, says former cellmate Luis Reyes. One day, he just stopped talking about being innocent or his wife setting him up, started reading books on law, psychology, said he was preparing himself, never said for what. Meanwhile, in Milfield, Clare Mercer was reassembling the pieces of her life with quiet determination. She sold their house about 3 years after the trial, recalls neighbor Dorothy Schultz. Too many memories, she said. Bought that little blue bungalow on Maple Street instead. Started planting a garden, joined the community theater. It was like watching someone thaw out slowly. Clare's transition from teacher to librarian removed her from the daily scrutiny of students and parents, providing a sanctuary of sorts. The library's director, Beatrice Hammond, became one of her few confidants. She never wanted to discuss the trial or Robert, Hammond says, arranging books on a cart. The only time I saw her truly upset was when his sister would come in. Those encounters were tense. Ellie Mercer had made it her mission to prove her brother's innocence. Working as a dental receptionist by day, she spent evenings and weekends researching similar cases and connecting with Innocence Project attorneys. Her persistence was both admirable and concerning to those around her. Ellie was obsessed, says her husband, Greg Porter. Our garage became this investigation hub with timelines on the walls, newspaper clippings. She'd drive to the prison twice a month without fail, even when we could barely afford the gas. Ellie's efforts yielded little progress in the legal arena, but succeeded in keeping doubts alive among certain segments of the community. The division was subtle, but persistent. Those who believed Robert was rightfully convicted, and those who thought Clare had somehow orchestrated his downfall. This division became most apparent during the annual Milfield Harvest Festival, 5 years after Robert's conviction. Clare, volunteering at the library's book sale booth, found herself face-to-face with Ellie for the first time in months. I remember watching them from across the square, says Sheriff Gaines. Couldn't hear what was said, but I saw Ellie hand Clare some kind of document. Clare's face went white. She left her post and didn't return for the rest of the day. The document, as later revealed, was a sworn statement from Derek Miller, a former classmate of Robert's, who claimed to have information about the Sinclair robbery. Miller, himself serving time for drug charges, alleged that he had heard rumors about who really committed the crime, and it wasn't Robert Mercer. Clare never publicly responded to these claims, but she did increase security at her home, installing motion sensor lights and a security system, unusual measures for Milfield at the time. She started coming to the shooting range where I worked part-time, recalls Marcus Webb, Clare's former colleague who had become a close friend. Said she wanted to learn to protect herself. I didn't ask from what or whom. Marcus and Clare's friendship deepened over the years, evolving into something that caused additional whispers around town. They were often seen having dinner at Donovan's Diner or attending community events together. Were they dating? That depends on who you ask, Martha Donovan says with a knowing look. They were certainly important to each other. Marcus was protective of her, especially when Robert's name came up. 7 years into Robert's sentence, Clare finally filed for divorce. The proceedings were complicated by Robert's incarceration, but eventually finalized. Clare did not revert to her maiden name, a decision that puzzled those close to her. I asked her about it once, Marcus admits. She said something about it being easier professionally, but there was more to it than that. I think part of her couldn't fully let go. Robert received the divorce papers without comment, according to prison records. His behavior remained exemplary. He had become a model prisoner, working as a teaching assistant in the GED program and leading a conflict resolution group for other inmates. The transformation was remarkable, says Warden Michael Collins. We see this sometimes, men who channel their energy into self-improvement, but there was something methodical about Mercer's approach. Like each certification, each good behavior mark was another box checked off a list. Robert began therapy in his 9th year of incarceration, sessions that were mandated as part of his eventual release preparation. His therapist, Dr. Linda Kaufman, noted his progress while flagging concerns. Patient demonstrates appropriate reflection on past behaviors, read one report, obtained with redactions. However, discussions about his ex-wife reveal underlying unresolved emotions. When asked directly about his feelings toward her, patient became withdrawn. As year 10 turned to 11, then 12, life in Milfield continued its slow rhythm. Clare was promoted to head librarian after Beatrice Hammond's retirement. Marcus Webb became vice principal at the high school. Sheriff Gaines began talking about retirement himself. Ellie Mercer's crusade for her brother's innocence gradually lost momentum after Derek Miller recanted his statement, admitting he had fabricated the story in hopes of receiving a reduced sentence. Disillusioned, Ellie turned her attention to preparing for Robert's eventual release. She bought that fixer-upper on Cedar Street, Greg Porter explains. Said Robert would need a place to stay when he got out. Spent every weekend for a year renovating it. It became her new obsession. As Robert's release date approached, the prison initiated a graduated re-entry program. He was permitted to work outside the facility at a construction site 3 days a week during his final year, returning to prison each night. He was quiet, kept to himself, remembers foreman Jack Ellis. Good worker, though, showed up on time, knew his stuff with carpentry. Never mentioned his conviction or his ex-wife. The only personal thing he ever shared was that he was planning to move back to his hometown after release. This news eventually reached Clare through Milfield's efficient grapevine. Security camera footage from the library shows her dropping a stack of books upon hearing this information from a patron. Clare came to my office the next day, recalls Sheriff Gaines. Asked if there were any legal restrictions that could prevent Robert from returning to Milfield. Unfortunately, there weren't. No restraining order had ever been filed, and his crime wasn't against her personally. In the months before Robert's scheduled release, Clare began taking unexplained days off work. Library assistant Kelly Johnson noticed changes in her behavior. She'd jump when the door opened, Johnson says. Started parking her car around back instead of in the main lot one time. I came into her office and found her staring at an old photo, her and Robert on their wedding day. She shoved it in a drawer when she saw me. 2 weeks before Robert's release date, Clare visited Marcus's home late in the evening, according to his statement to police months later. Their conversation that night would prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. She told me she had made a terrible mistake, Marcus recounts, his voice heavy. I assumed she meant testifying against Robert, but now looking back, I think she meant something else entirely. As Robert Mercer completed his final processing for release, a guard asked about his plans. Going home, Robert replied, his expression unreadable. Got some unfinished business to take care of. Freedom has a scent. For Robert Mercer, standing outside the prison gates on a crisp October morning, it was the absence of industrial disinfectant and the presence of fallen leaves and car exhaust. First day out is disorienting, explains parole officer Judith Ramirez. 14 years is a long time. The world moved on without him. Smartphones, social media, streaming services, even the way people talk changes. Ellie waited in the parking lot, practically bouncing with nervous energy as she leaned against her SUV. Security footage shows their reunion, her rushing forward, him hesitating before accepting her embrace, his movements still measured, institutional. He looked so different, Ellie later confessed. Older, of course, but it was more than that. His eyes were calculating, like he was constantly assessing everything. The 3-hour drive back to Milfield was filled with Ellie's nervous chatter about the changes in town, the house she'd prepared, the job prospects she'd researched. Robert mainly listened, asking occasional questions about specific people. He wanted to know if Clare had remarried, Ellie recalls. When I said no, he just nodded. Then he asked about Sheriff Gaines, whether he was still around. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern to his questions. News of Robert's return spread through Milfield before he even arrived. At the library, Clare called in sick for the first time in over a year. She sounded strange on the phone, library assistant Kelly Johnson remembers. Asked me to bring any mail or packages to her back door rather than the front. Said she wasn't feeling well, but I knew what day it was. Everyone did. Sheriff Gaines made a point of driving past the Cedar Street house where Robert would be staying, a casual show of awareness. Standard procedure with any returning offender, Gaines insists. But I'll admit, this case was different, personal. I'd watched the fallout from both sides for 14 years. Robert's first week back in Milfield passed quietly. He kept to himself, working on finishing touches to the house, painting shutters, fixing cabinet doors. Several residents reported seeing him at Gordon's Hardware, purchasing supplies, his interactions polite but minimal. He was just there, says store owner Gordon Phillips. Paid in cash, thanked me with this intense eye contact that made me uncomfortable. Not threatening exactly, but deliberate. The first notable incident occurred 9 days after Robert's return. Clare, resuming her normal routine, was shelving books in the library's reference section when she turned to find Robert standing at the end of the aisle. Library security cameras captured their first encounter in 14 years. Clare taking an instinctive step backward, a book clutched to her chest. Robert remaining perfectly still, hands visible at his sides. I couldn't hear what they were saying, Kelly Johnson says, but it lasted exactly 3 minutes. Clare's face went through about a dozen emotions. Robert's never changed. That evening, Clare called Marcus Webb. Phone records show the call lasted 27 minutes. The next day, Marcus began driving Clare to and from work, an arrangement that didn't go unnoticed in the small town. Everyone assumed they were finally official, Martha Donovan says. But Clare told me it wasn't like that. He's just being careful, she said. Wouldn't elaborate on what that meant. Robert established a routine over the following weeks. Morning runs along the county road, afternoons working on the house, or at the part-time maintenance job Ellie had arranged at the community center. Evenings spent mostly alone, though he occasionally joined Ellie and her husband for dinner. He was different with us than with others, Greg Porter observes. More relaxed, he'd even laugh sometimes, but certain topics were off limits. His time inside, the robbery, Clare. 3 weeks after his return, Robert attended Sunday service at Milfield Community Church, causing a subtle redistribution of parishioners in the pews. Reverend Michael Wilson, new to town since Robert's conviction, made a pointed sermon about redemption and second chances. After the service, about half the congregation made a point of welcoming him back, Reverend Wilson recalls. The other half made an equally pointed exit through the side door. Clare, who usually attended, was absent that day. The following Tuesday, Robert filed paperwork to have his voting rights restored, a process that required him to visit the county clerk's office where Marcus Webb's mother, Judith, had worked for 20 years. He was perfectly pleasant, Judith Webb says. Asked after Marcus by name, said he'd heard good things about his work at the school. It felt like a message was being sent. That evening, Marcus confronted Clare during dinner at her house, according to his later statement. I told her she needed to file a restraining order, Marcus recounts. Robert was clearly establishing his presence, making sure she knew he was back and reintegrating into the community. Clare just kept saying, "It's not that simple." Sheriff Gaines noticed increased traffic past Clare's bungalow, neighbors looking out for her, but also rubberneckers drawn to potential drama. He increased patrols in the area without making it obvious. Small-town curiosity can be protective or dangerous, Gaines observes. I've seen it go both ways. On the 1-month anniversary of his release, Robert visited the Sinclair gas station, now under new management, but still in the same location. He purchased a coffee and a newspaper, chatting briefly with the cashier, a young man who had been a child when the robbery occurred. He seemed normal, the cashier told Sheriff Gaines later. Paid with exact change. Only weird thing was he asked if the security cameras were new. Said technology had really improved. That same evening, Claire failed to appear for her shift at the library's monthly book club. Kelly Johnson called Marcus, who found Claire's car in her driveway, but received no answer at the door. After 20 minutes of knocking and calling, Marcus contacted Sheriff Gaines. Body camera footage shows their entry into Claire's home. Nothing obviously disturbed, dinner preparations abandoned in the kitchen, Claire's phone and purse still present. No signs of struggle or forced entry. My first thought was Robert, Sheriff Gaines admits. But he had a solid alibi. Security footage showed him at the community center until 7:30 p.m., then at Donovan's diner until almost 9. Claire's neighbor reported seeing her arrive home around 5:45 p.m. Claire reappeared the next morning, calling Sheriff Gaines herself. She claimed to have taken sleeping pills and not heard the commotion, though toxicology reports later found no trace of medication in her system. She refused to elaborate on her whereabouts or state of mind. She was hiding something, Marcus insists. After that night, she changed, started carrying a small notebook everywhere, writing in it constantly, wouldn't let it out of her sight. The following week brought another development when Ellie visited Claire at the library, their first direct interaction since Robert's return. Security cameras show an intense, whispered conversation, with Claire eventually passing Ellie a small envelope. "I'm not at liberty to discuss what was in it," Ellie says stiffly. "But it changed everything I thought I knew about my brother's case." 3 days later, Ellie moved out of her home with Greg, temporarily relocating to her mother's house in Lincoln, 2 hours away. Greg, bewildered, told friends she needed time to process some new information. Robert showed no visible reaction to his sister's departure. He continued his routines, though residents noticed increased interactions with specific townspeople: the retired court reporter, the former prosecutor's secretary, a bartender who'd worked at the Rusty Nail the night of the robbery 14 years earlier. He was investigating, Sheriff Gaines says, as quietly as possible, but I recognized what he was doing, gathering information. The question was, what exactly was he trying to discover? 6 weeks after Robert's return, Claire requested a meeting with Sheriff Gaines, bringing her small notebook. Security footage shows them talking in his office for over 2 hours, Claire becoming increasingly agitated, Gaines taking notes. "She was building a case," Gaines says carefully. "Not against Robert, at least not directly. She wanted to correct something, but needed proof first." The day after this meeting, Robert visited the high school during lunch hour, ostensibly to inquire about GED classes for a friend. He encountered Marcus in the hallway, leading to their first direct interaction. "It was surreal," Marcus says. "He thanked me for being there for Claire during his absence, like he'd been away on business, not in prison. Then he said something I'll never forget. It must be hard, loving someone who's living a lie." That evening, Claire called both Sheriff Gaines and Marcus, asking them to meet her the following morning at the library before opening hours. She said she was finally ready to reveal the truth about what happened 14 years ago. She sounded relieved, Marcus remembers. Like a weight was lifting. She said, "After tomorrow, everything will make sense. I can finally stop looking over my shoulder." Security footage shows Claire entering the library at 7:15 a.m. Sheriff Gaines arrived at 7:40 a.m., followed by Marcus at 7:43 a.m. They found the doors unlocked, but no sign of Claire in the main area. What they discovered in the rare books room would eventually make sense of everything that had happened since Robert Mercer's return to Milfield, and everything that had happened 14 years before. The rare books room of Milfield Public Library is small, just 12 by 14 feet, with glass-fronted cases and a reading table at its center. When Sheriff Gaines and Marcus Webb entered at 7:45 a.m. that morning, the first thing they noticed was the open window, curtains billowing in the autumn breeze. The second thing they noticed was Claire's notebook, open on the table beside a stack of newspaper clippings, court transcripts, and what appeared to be prison correspondence. A coffee mug, still warm, sat nearby. It looked like someone had been interrupted while working, Sheriff Gaines recalls. The chair was pushed back hastily. Claire's reading glasses were folded on top of the notebook, but her phone was gone. Marcus immediately tried calling her. "We heard it ringing, faint, like it was outside. That's when we knew something was wrong." Body cam footage from Sheriff Gaines shows their discovery. Claire's phone in the bushes beneath the open window, its screen cracked. No signs of blood or struggle were immediately apparent, but forensic analysis would later detect trace evidence on the windowsill. I called for backup and told Marcus to wait in the main library area, Gaines says. Then I did what I should have done 14 years ago. I really looked at the evidence. The notebook contained what could only be described as an investigation, meticulous notes about the Sinclair robbery, interviews with witnesses Sheriff Gaines had never questioned, and discrepancies in the original case file. But most disturbing were the last few pages, where Clare had written extensively about someone she referred to only as M. At first I assumed she meant Marcus, Sheriff Gaines admits. But as I read further, it became clear she was documenting threats, veiled conversations, and surveillance, things that started long before Robert's release. While waiting for backup, Marcus made a discovery of his own. I was pacing, worried about Clare, when I noticed the book cart near the front desk, he recalls. There was a book on top, The Count of Monte Cristo, with a bookmark sticking out. I opened it out of nervous habit. The bookmark was actually a photograph, Robert and Clare on their wedding day, but with a third person cropped partially out of the frame, just an arm visible around Clare's shoulders. On the back, a handwritten note. Remember our promise. When I showed it to Sheriff Gaines, something changed in his expression, Marcus says, like pieces were falling into place. Backup arrived, and a search for Clare began. First the library grounds, then expanding outward. Security camera footage from businesses along Main Street was collected. Robert Mercer was brought in for questioning. The interview room footage shows Robert composed, offering direct answers with minimal emotion. Yes, I knew Clare would be at the library early. She keeps the same schedule she always has, he tells Sheriff Gaines. No, I haven't spoken to her since our brief conversation in the reference section 3 weeks ago. Yes, I have an alibi. I was running on the county road, checked the traffic cameras at the intersection of Route 16. The alibi checked out. Traffic camera footage showed Robert jogging past at 7:22 a.m. wearing a gray sweatshirt and black athletic pants, making it physically impossible for him to have been at the library during the critical time window. By noon, the situation had escalated. Clare Mercer was officially declared missing. The library remained closed, now a potential crime scene. And Ellie Mercer returned to town, driving directly to the sheriff's office with the envelope Clare had given her weeks earlier. I should have shown you this immediately, Ellie tells Sheriff Gaines in the recorded interview. But I needed to verify some things first. Clare gave me names, dates, bank records. It changes everything about Robert's conviction. The contents of the envelope revealed that Clare had been looking into financial transactions connected to the Sinclair robbery for years. She had traced unusual deposits into an account belonging to Marcus Webb, $5,000, 2 days after the robbery, followed by smaller regular payments that continued for nearly a decade. I couldn't believe it, Ellie says, visibly shaken. Clare was building a case to exonerate Robert, not because she thought he was innocent, but because she knew he was. She knew because she helped set him up. Sheriff Gaines immediately brought Marcus in for questioning, confronting him with the financial records. Marcus denied everything at first, Gaines recounts. Said that deposits were from side jobs, tutoring, odd repairs. But when I showed him Clare's notes about M, something broke. He started talking and couldn't stop. The recorded confession reveals a story 14 years in the making. Marcus admitted to robbing the Sinclair station, wearing a mask and carrying a gun he'd taken from Robert and Clare's home. The plan had been Clare's idea initially, a way to solve their financial problems after Robert lost his job and started drinking heavily. Clare and I were having an affair, Marcus confesses in the recording. Had been for almost a year before the robbery. We never meant for anyone to get hurt. The gun wasn't even supposed to be loaded. But when the young cashier resisted, Marcus panicked and struck him with the pistol. The plan quickly evolved. Clare would plant some of the money at home, find it, and report her suspicions. With Robert's prior record, they believed a conviction was likely but expected a shorter sentence. 7 years, maybe less with good behavior, Marcus says hollowly. That's what we thought. Enough time for us to figure out our future together. But when the judge said 14 years, Clare fell apart afterward, said we'd gone too far. The guilt and fear kept them from pursuing their relationship openly for years. Clare insisted on waiting to file for divorce, made Marcus promise to keep their involvement secret. The regular payments were his way of easing his conscience. She'd taken brief teaching jobs in other districts for extra money, but it was never enough, Marcus explains. I was helping with her mortgage, car repairs, trying to make something right out of all the wrong we'd done. Sheriff Gaines, listening to this confession, felt his own guilt resurfacing. I'd had doubts about the case, he admits. The witness descriptions never quite matched Robert. The violence seemed out of character, even with his record. But Clare's testimony was so convincing, and I wanted the case closed. As Marcus's confession continued, a critical question remained unanswered. Where was Clare now? I swear I don't know, Marcus insists repeatedly. She'd been acting strange for weeks, said someone was watching her. I thought it was paranoia about Robert, but now, I don't know. The search for Clare intensified as night fell. Deputies checked abandoned buildings, wooded areas near her home, the lakefront. Volunteers formed search parties. Robert joined the efforts, methodically covering his assigned area with the same focused intensity he'd shown since his return. At 11:17 p.m., Robert's search route took him to the old railroad bridge on the edge of town, a spot where he and Clare had often spent time during their early relationship. Security footage from a distant gas station camera shows his flashlight moving systematically along the bridge, then stopping suddenly. He called it in immediately, Sheriff Gaines says. His voice was completely flat. Said, I found something by the bridge. You need to come now. What Robert discovered was Clare's scarf, the blue one she'd been wearing that morning according to security footage. Snagged on a broken railing below, the creek was shallow but rocky. A subsequent search of the area would find her library badge half buried in mud near the water's edge. As forensic teams processed the scene, Robert stood apart from the other searchers, his face unreadable in the harsh portable lights. He asked me just once if we were looking for a missing person or a body, Sheriff Gaines remembers. I told him it was too soon to know. He nodded and said, She finally told the truth, didn't she? I didn't answer, but I think he knew. The search continued through the night without further discoveries. Marcus Webb, after completing his formal confession, was held in custody on charges related to the original robbery, assault, and fraud. Ellie stayed with Robert, both of them waiting at his house for updates. At 9:45 a.m. the next day, a development. Clare's car was found in the long-term parking lot at the bus station in Grand Island, 60 miles away. Security footage showed a woman in a hooded jacket parking it there at 10:30 p.m. the previous night, hours after Clare went missing and while search efforts were underway. The timing made no sense, Sheriff Gaines says. Unless Clare had left the library voluntarily, been hiding somewhere all day, then driven to Grand Island under cover of darkness. The forensic results complicated matters further. Analysis of the rare books room showed multiple fingerprints. Clare's, of course, but also Marcus's, Robert's, and several unidentified sets. The trace evidence from the windowsill was determined to be Clare's blood, though the amount was minimal, consistent with a small cut or scrape. Most puzzling was the discovery of a motel receipt in Clare's car, dated 3 days earlier for a single night's stay at the Travelodge in North Platte, nearly 2 hours from Milfield. The motel's security footage confirmed Clare had indeed stayed there, meeting with an unidentified man in the lobby. She was gathering evidence, Ellie insists. The man was a former inmate who'd been at the state penitentiary with Robert. Clare told me she'd tracked down several of them, trying to build a case for Robert's innocence. 2 days into the investigation, with Clare still missing, Robert requested a meeting with Sheriff Gaines. The conversation, recorded as standard procedure, revealed a man grappling with 14 years of misplaced blame. I hated her for so long, Robert says, his voice controlled but strained. Spent years planning how I'd confront her, make her admit what she'd done. That's why I came back to Milfield, not for revenge, but for the truth. When asked if he'd had any contact with Clare beyond their brief library encounter, Robert hesitates before answering. She came to the house one night, about a week after I got back, he finally admits. Ellie was in Lincoln for the day. Clare was different, nervous but determined, said she needed to explain some things, that it wasn't what I thought. According to Robert, Clare revealed portions of the truth that night, that she and Marcus had been involved, that they'd orchestrated the robbery, but that the 14-year sentence had never been their intention. She kept saying she thought it would be less time. Like that made it better, Robert says, a flash of anger breaking through his composed exterior. 14 years of my life gone because they wanted to be together and needed my gun to do it. Sheriff Gaines asks the critical question, "Did you confront her at the library yesterday morning?" Robert's response is measured. "No, but I knew she was finally going to come clean to you. Ellie told me about the meeting, about the evidence Clare had gathered to clear my name. I thought maybe I could finally stop being angry." As the search for Clare entered its third day, the evidence pointed in contradictory directions. The blood on the windowsill suggested foul play, but the carefully moved car indicated planning. The scattered personal items looked like signs of a struggle, yet the methodically organized research materials spoke of intention. People in town started speculating, Martha Donovan recalls. Some thought Robert had finally taken his revenge. Others believed Clare had fled out of guilt once Marcus confessed. A few even suggested they'd planned it together, that Robert's return and Clare's disappearance were somehow coordinated. On the evening of the third day, with rain threatening to hamper search efforts, a state police officer reviewing security footage from gas stations along Interstate 80 noticed something. A woman resembling Clare, wearing sunglasses and a hat, purchasing a bus ticket to Denver at the Grand Island station the night her car was left there. It looked like her, Sheriff Gaines acknowledges, but the image quality was poor, and the behavior didn't align with the evidence of struggle at the library. Something still wasn't adding up. That night, Robert sat alone on his front porch, watching the rain begin to fall. Across town, Marcus Webb remained in custody, refusing further interviews without his lawyer present. And somewhere, whether in danger, in hiding, or in flight, Clare Mercer held the final pieces of a 14-year-old puzzle that had fractured countless lives. The next morning brought the discovery that would transform the search for a missing woman into something far more grim. A kayaker spotted it, Sheriff Gaines says quietly. Caught against a fallen tree about 2 miles downstream from the railroad bridge. The rain had raised the water level just enough. The medical examiner would later determine that Clare Mercer had died from blunt force trauma to the head, sustained before she entered the water. The time of death was estimated between 7:30 and 8:30 a.m. on the morning she disappeared, exactly when she would have been waiting in the library for Sheriff Gaines and Marcus to arrive. As news of the discovery spread through Milfield, Robert Mercer continued methodically unpacking boxes in his sister's renovated house. A neighbor reported seeing him carefully arrange books on a shelf, his movements as measured and deliberate as they had been since the day he returned from prison. The question now facing Sheriff Gaines was no longer where Clare Mercer had gone, but who had made sure she would never reveal the full truth about what happened 14 years ago, and why. Rain fell steadily on the day of Clare Mercer's funeral. The service was sparsely attended, a reflection of a woman whose life had become increasingly isolated and whose death had exposed long-buried secrets. The town was divided on how to mourn her, Reverend Wilson explains. Some saw her as a victim, others as a manipulator who got what she deserved. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Robert Mercer attended, standing at the back of the church, his face impassive. Sheriff Gaines watched him carefully throughout the service. Marcus Webb, still in custody awaiting trial for his role in the original robbery, was notably absent. I expected some kind of reaction from Robert, Sheriff Gaines admits. Grief, satisfaction, anything. But there was nothing visible. It was like watching someone observe a stranger's funeral. The investigation into Clare's murder proceeded methodically, with forensic evidence now at the center. The medical examiner's report detailed defensive wounds on Clare's hands and forearms, indicating she had fought her attacker. DNA found under her fingernails was being processed, a potential breakthrough in identifying the killer. 4 days after the funeral, Sheriff Gaines received the DNA results. It wasn't what I expected, he says. Not Robert's DNA, not Marcus's either. Female DNA with familial markers suggesting a close relative of Robert Mercer. All attention immediately turned to Ellie Mercer, who had returned to Lincoln after the discovery of Clare's body. State police officers brought her in for questioning, collecting a DNA sample that confirmed the match. The interrogation video shows Ellie initially calm, then gradually unraveling as evidence is presented. "I never meant to kill her," she finally admits, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to talk to her, make her understand what she'd done to our family." According to Ellie's confession, she had gone to the library that morning after learning from Robert that Clare planned to reveal everything to Sheriff Gaines. Ellie believed Clare was going to pin the entire robbery plan on Marcus to minimize her own involvement, explains District Attorney Laura Hernandez. She was afraid Clare would manipulate the narrative again, potentially harming Robert's chances of true exoneration and restitution. The confrontation in the rare books room escalated quickly. Clare refused to include in her confession how she had actively worked to maximize Robert's sentence by embellishing her testimony about the bloody shirt and missing gun. Clare told Ellie that some truths were better left buried, Sheriff Gaines says, reading from the official statement. That's when Ellie lost control. She grabbed a heavy bookend from the table and struck Clare once. When Clare tried to reach for her phone, Ellie struck her again, harder. Panicking, Ellie helped a semi-conscious Clare out the window, intending to get her to a hospital without being seen. But as they reached the old railroad bridge, taking a back route to avoid Main Street, Clare regained lucidity and threatened to tell authorities about the attack. "The second confrontation was fatal," Sheriff Gaines says grimly. "One push, and Clare went over the railing. Ellie claims she didn't intend for her to hit her head on the rocks below, but the medical examiner stated that the blunt force trauma was consistent with such a fall. What followed was a desperate attempt at misdirection. Ellie took Clare's scarf, placing it on the broken railing to suggest Clare had fallen accidentally. She then used Clare's phone to text Marcus, canceling the meeting, before disposing of the phone in the bushes near the library. Most calculating was her decision to drive Clare's car to Grand Island that night, wearing Clare's hooded jacket and sunglasses, and purchasing a bus ticket to Denver to create the impression Clare had fled. It shows premeditation, District Attorney Hernandez argues. Not of the murder itself, perhaps, but certainly of the cover-up. The fact that she rejoined the search parties, even encouraged her brother to help look for Clare, demonstrates a disturbing level of deception. When asked about Robert's knowledge of her actions, Ellie was adamant. "He didn't know. I never told him. Robert came back to Milfield for answers, not revenge." Forensic analysis of Ellie's car and clothing provided additional evidence supporting her confession. Traces of Clare's blood were found in the trunk, where Ellie admitted to temporarily placing her body before returning after dark to move it into the creek. As the case against Ellie proceeded, attention turned to the contents of Clare's notebook, specifically the entries about M that had initially been assumed to reference Marcus. "The more we analyzed her writing, the clearer it became," Sheriff Gaines explains. Clare wasn't writing about Marcus Webb. She was documenting interactions with Michael Linwood, a former inmate who had served time with Robert. This revelation connected to the North Platte motel meeting. Clare had been meeting with Linwood, who had provided information about conversations Robert had in prison, specifically threats Robert had made about Clare. Linwood was essentially blackmailing Clare, Sheriff Gaines says, threatening to tell Robert about her regular prison visits to inmates who knew him, how she'd been checking on him through intermediaries all these years. These prison visits, documented in Clare's meticulous notes, revealed a more complex narrative than anyone had initially understood. For years, Clare had been quietly tracking Robert's progress, his behavior, even his health, through a network of released inmates she paid for information. She wasn't just gathering evidence to exonerate him, Sheriff Gaines explains. She was monitoring him out of a mixture of guilt and fear. The notebook detailed specific concerning incidents, fights where Robert had mentioned her name, conversations where he discussed what he'd do when released. This revelation raised new questions about Robert's actual intentions upon returning to Milfield. Had his measured, methodical behavior been genuine rehabilitation, or something more calculated? With Ellie's confession secured and formal charges filed, Sheriff Gaines conducted one final interview with Robert Mercer, hoping to complete the picture of the 14-year tragedy. The recorded conversation reveals Robert's careful composure finally cracking when presented with Clare's notebook entries about his prison behavior. "Of course I was angry," he acknowledges, voice tight. "Wouldn't you be?" but that doesn't mean I was planning to hurt her. When shown the evidence of Clare's years of monitoring him, something shifts in Robert's expression. She was keeping tabs on me all that time. For the first time since his return, genuine emotion breaks through, not anger, but a complex mixture of disbelief and something almost like vindication. "I always felt watched in prison," he says quietly, like she could still see me. "I thought I was paranoid." As for his true intentions in returning to Milfield, Robert finally admits the complete truth. "I wanted her to confess, publicly. I wanted everyone who looked at me like I was guilty all these years to know what she did. That was my only goal." When asked if he had suspected Ellie's involvement in Clare's death, Robert's response is measured. "I knew something wasn't right. The way she suddenly returned from Lincoln, how she insisted on joining the search party near the bridge. But I didn't want to believe it." In the aftermath of these revelations, Milfield struggled to reconcile the multiple versions of truth that had defined the community for 14 years. "The ripple effects were everywhere," Martha Donovan observes. "Every conversation Clare had with a customer, every time Robert felt watched in prison, every moment Ellie spent renovating that house while plotting confrontation, all happening simultaneously in different places, created by that one original lie." Marcus Webb accepted a plea deal, receiving 12 years for the armed robbery, assault on the gas station attendant, and his role in framing Robert. During sentencing, he addressed the court with a statement that seemed directed at Robert, who sat expressionless in the gallery. "I convinced myself we were in love," Marcus said. "That justified everything else. But real love doesn't destroy lives for convenience. I'd serve 100 years if it would give Robert back his 14. Ellie Mercer was convicted of second-degree murder and evidence tampering, sentenced to 25 years. Her husband filed for divorce shortly after her arrest, unable to reconcile the woman he married with the one capable of such calculated actions. For his part, Robert Mercer received financial compensation for his wrongful conviction, though the settlement acknowledged Clare's testimony had been the primary evidence rather than any misconduct by law enforcement. Sheriff Gaines, nevertheless, carried his own burden of responsibility. "I should have looked deeper," he admits, having announced his retirement shortly after the case concluded. Seen the inconsistencies, questioned Clare's story more thoroughly. 14 years of an innocent man's life is on my conscience too. Robert didn't remain in Milfield. After settling his affairs and selling Ellie's house, he moved to Oregon, where public records show he works as a carpenter and occasionally speaks to law students about wrongful convictions. The most disturbing aspect of the case, reflects District Attorney Hernandez, was how ordinary the original motivations were, not grand passion or deep-seated hatred, just financial convenience, the path of least resistance. Clare and Marcus needed money and saw Robert as an acceptable sacrifice. The Sinclair gas station still stands at the edge of town, though under different ownership. The rare books room at the library remained closed for months after Clare's death, eventually reopening with a new layout. The old railroad bridge was finally demolished and replaced, removing the physical reminder of where Clare Mercer's life ended. In the end, nobody got what they wanted, Martha Donovan observes, wiping down the counter of her diner. Clare lost her life, Ellie her freedom, Marcus his reputation, Robert 14 irreplaceable years. Even the town lost something, that belief that we really knew our neighbors. On the 1-year anniversary of Clare's death, security cameras captured Robert Mercer visiting the Milfield cemetery. He placed no flowers on her grave, spoke no words captured by the distant microphones. He simply stood there briefly, a man finally freed from both prison and the weight of misplaced blame, before walking away without looking back. Some forms of justice come too late, Sheriff Gaines, now retired, reflects. The legal system eventually corrected the record, assigned the proper blame. But there's no sentence, no restitution that can truly balance the scales after so much damage has been done. The case files on both the Sinclair robbery and Clare Mercer's murder were officially closed, but in Milfield, the story continues to evolve with each retelling, a cautionary tale about the cascading consequences of deception, the corrosive power of resentment, and the fragile nature of truth in a community where everyone believes they know everyone else's business. And in a town that doesn't appear on most maps, where the grain silo still casts the longest shadow, neighbors now lock their doors at night.